As we kick off a new week, episode 11 of Sport SA Daily Diary chats to MC, TV presenter and host Dan Nicholl. Good morning, Dan. How are you doing today?
Morning, Adam. Thank you for having me on. I think I'm doing all right. It is a surreal world, and day by day it takes a little more getting used to. But in the greater scheme of things, I think the Nicholl family are chugging along all right.
And the Nicholl family consists of obviously your wife and two small kids and the big dog. How's the big dog doing without being able to be walked?
Yeah, I think like a lot of pets in a state of confusion. I think animals do tend to pick up on when we're not at our best or when the world isn't quite in equilibrium. And every time I walk into the garage, which is where I store the harness that I use to take Stavros, who is a 76-kilogram bull mastiff, out for a walk, he gets very excited and comes charging up and then looks at me forlornly when I leave his harness inside and come out of the garage, and he realizes we're not going for a walk. So he's probably the saddest person in the house at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure. And Dan, what are you guys doing to keep a little bit active and fit? I noticed you were doing a triathlon and you've done some underwater golf. What else have you done to...
Probably my biggest effort was the very first day of lockdown. I went into Sportsman's Warehouse the day before we all got closed off, and I was looking for things that could distract my children because both my wife and I are working from home. And amongst other things, I found a large trampoline, and I asked the salesman if it was fairly easy to assemble. And he nodded with a big smile that in retrospect said, "You idiot, of course it's not, but I'm going to sell it to you anyway." He did. And he said it should take about half an hour or so. It took me 8 hours to assemble this wretched device. And it turned out, I thought it was reasonably big. It's about the size of Belgium once it's all put together. But I have it erected. It is sitting in the garden, and it has caused the kids a great deal of joy. My wife escapes from her desk to join in the fun as well. And that's been a good way to keep everybody both activated and a little distracted.
So have you been bouncing away as well?
With very little grace, and given that I erected it, a certain degree of circumspection as to whether this will hold up. But so far it's been there in one piece, and I'm slowly but surely honing my skills. And with the Olympics postponed by a year and trampolining, I think, still being an Olympic sport, perhaps there's my gateway to get to Tokyo.
So we chatted to Dominic Mann a couple of days ago, and her gymnastics career started on a trampoline. So this may well be the start of an Olympic career for you as well.
Well, there's a guy called Bill Nissen, Nisen. He's the guy who effectively invented the trampoline. He was an acrobat, I think, in the 1930s. And he saw acrobats falling into nets and thought, can I find a way of getting them to bounce back up? And there is a natural symmetry between trampolining and gymnastics. But there's also a deep dislike for Bill Nissen because it's because of him that I had to spend 8 hours erecting a trampoline.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Dan, you've had a very successful career as a TV presenter and an MC. Where did it all start for you, Dan?
Always difficult to put an exact finger on it because what I do, I think, brings in a variety of skill sets, the speaking in public, the writing, which you do a lot of when you're in television, the path into, I suppose, the public spotlight. When I was 16, I spent a year in Australia as a Rotary Youth Exchange student, having left my then native Zimbabwe. And I spoke to probably 100-odd schools, Rotary clubs, community groups through the year. And without realizing, that was a big part of learning the art of speaking to an audience, working out how to keep them interested and hopefully entertained. And when I got back to Zimbabwe after that, I had 2 years to finish school. And during that time, I spent some time on the local radio circuit with Radio 3. Zimbabwe at that stage had 4 radio stations that were quite innovatively named. There was Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, and Radio 4. Quite a lot of thought went into that creative process. I was on Radio 3. And from there, when I got down to the University of Cape Town, where I ended up at university, I joined UCT Radio, and I ended up working there for a few years. And from there, got picked up by Cape Talk and worked first with Martin Bailey and then with John Matham as a sports anchor and general idiot when light entertainment is required after a particularly serious or somber story. And I did a year while I was still in Cape Town, the year United beat Chelsea in the Champions League final, which I think you'll remember, where I was hosting Champions League football for a season. But if I look at the Dan Nicholl Show in particular, in 2003, I put together a pilot for a show inspired by a show I'd seen in Australia called The Footy Show, and a show that Bob Skinstad, who was at that stage captain of Western Province, had seen in New Zealand called the Lion Road Sports Cafe. We bought the guy from the Sports Cafe out from New Zealand. We filmed a pilot. We thought it was brilliant. I was prepared to become a television superstar, buy Barbados, marry a range of lingerie models, and stardom was clearly beckoning. And it took 12 years to get, so 30, it was 2002, 13 years to 2015 to finally get the Dan Nicholl Show on board. My good friend Kelvin Watts joined me. We put together a platform, filmed a pilot that looked a little like a high school theatre production in retrospect. But luckily, a lady called Suzanne Stevens, who was one of the founders and directors of BrightRock, the life insurance brand, saw it, liked what she saw some potential, and backed the show. And when the lockdown finishes and we do get back in studio, we will be commencing our 11th season of the Dan Nicholl Show, and still with BrightRock.
That's fantastic. Have you actually got any sportsmen left to interview?
One of the things that a lot of people told me when I started this out, aside from the fact is, Daniel, there's no chance you can do a show. This is going to be rubbish. It's not going to work. There was a lot of constructive criticism, people thought, but what it really was just inspiration to me to prove people wrong. And people did say, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough stories. And we have repeated a number of guests, but not just for the sake of repeating them, because they've got additions to their story, or they've taken new paths. We've had Sia Kolisi on before, but he was going to be on the first episode of season 11 because his story has changed so dramatically over the last year or two. But we've also found such extraordinary people. And if I look at some of the people who aren't household names, but who've done such remarkable stuff, who've had these incredible achievements. I look at somebody like Grant Lottering, the cyclist who was declared dead when he crashed, was told he'd never walk again, and is now cycling all over the world doing these mad challenges to raise money. He's one of the most inspirational people I know. Ron Rutland, whose succession of midlife crises around bicycles is staggering. He cycled for 2.5 years through Africa. He cycled from London to Tokyo for the last Rugby World Cup. Ordinary, everyday people who just do remarkable, remarkable things. And yes, we'll have an A.B. de Villiers on the show, or we'll have a Jamie Redknapp on the show, or a Hashim Amla on the show, a lot of the really big sports stars. But often it's the guys who you haven't heard of who take your breath away, and you go, wow, I can't believe this person did that. And when you look at somebody like Chris Burtish, say, who did that stand-up paddleboard trip across the Atlantic Ocean for 3 months, which was sheer and utter madness, the craziest thing any of our guests have ever done, it really makes you understand just the scope of potential that people have, and also what remarkable people we do have here in South Africa.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, our sporting fraternities, it must be close on the best in the world, and certainly the most diverse. Just from my little show over the last week, I've had, all over the place, gymnastics and rugby and soccer and the lot, and there's still so much more to come, so it's great. Dan, on your show, you get a gift at the end of every show. Can you maybe share one of the strangest or one of the most memorable gifts that you've received to date?
We've had a very interesting selection over the year. The idea behind it is to celebrate the careers that people have had, and something that reflects or represents the change in the lives of these amazing people. And depending on who they are, it can be something from their sporting career. We have a lot of non-sporting people. So if I look back, in terms of memorable, Akani Simbine, the Olympic sprinter, gave me one of the 2 spikes that he wore in the 2016 Olympic 100-meter final, where he finished 5th behind Usain Bolt. which was quite remarkable. Cameron van der Berg, who's a very dear friend of mine, and Chad Leclos, on separate occasions and unbeknownst to each other, have given me a FINA World Cup gold medal from their swimming career. To hand those over, staggering. I got from Shelley Russell, the international hockey player, the sister of Brett Russell. Shelley, definitely the considerably better and more successful athlete. Shelley gave me her international jersey, her South Africa jersey from her very first game, from her debut, which to hand that over, I thought was incredibly generous. And then there have been some oddities. Joanne Strauss is also a dear friend of mine. We do a lot of work together with the BMW brand. We MC a lot of events together. She took the change moment to heart, went for something really personal, if a little quirky, and gave me the successful pregnancy test from her first little one, as her life was about to change considerably. I received Khan Morby gave me the loudhailer that the Parlotones use on stage. Ard Matthews gave me one of his guitar straps. And then I've had a number of books that people have given me. John Flismus gave me a painting that he did. He actually has a flair for art. So the enfant terrible of the community of comedy gave me something I wasn't expecting. And what I really love is when people dig a little deep and they find something that is particularly cool and fun. And then what works for me is I love the fact that I can reciprocate, and we don't always get it spot on, but I try and find something fun to give to our guests. And where this started, do I receive a guest, but then I get a gift and then I give one. We've had Kevin Peterson on the show 3 times. And the first time we had him on the show, he'd only just ended his time with England. It was a very fractious departure. And there were a number of members of the England cricketing establishment with whom Kevin was not on the very best of terms. And he'd been bemoaning that his first class seat had a broken video screen on his flight into Johannesburg. And at the end of the show, I explained that I felt very bad for him, and I didn't know how he got through such a terrible, terrible time of having no video in his first class flatbed as waitresses and air hostesses massaged his feet to champagne. And so I was going to help him, and I'd procured some literature so he had something to read. And I proceeded to give him Andrew Strauss's autobiography. One look at it and threw it out into our studio audience, which caused much laughter.
Fantastic. And Dan, what do you do with all this memorabilia? I mean, you're going to be able to open up a Dan Nicholl Museum one of these days.
Well, we're working on curating it all in an online space because there are some wonderful stories to so many of those pieces. We've also, though, got, if you've ever come to the Dan Nicholl Show as a studio audience member, and we have a 50 or 60 strong studio audience for every show, we have a series of presentation cases. So before the show, when you're having a drink, or afterwards, in between meeting the guests, saying hello to me, getting something to eat or drink, you can have a walk around, and we've got all of these pieces presented, and you can have a look through them, see what's there, and find out some of the stories of the guests we've had over the years.
Oh, fantastic. And Dan, in your show, you also tend to put yourself in a precarious position every now and then, doing various challenges. Who roped you into doing that? Was that an idea of yours, or was that someone that put it up to you? And which has been your most entertaining moment with those little clips?
In terms of how they eventuated, we worked out pretty quickly. In terms of the nature of the show, it's often me having a bit of fun at other people's expense. We try very hard. We'll never embarrass people in the sense of this is something that makes you uncomfortable. We'll embarrass you in terms of this is you wearing a really dreadful Christmas sweater when you were 8, that kind of space. But we find that the audience responds really well to me being on the wrong end of this. And if I'm out of my comfort zone, it can make for really good television. And it first got driven home with the final episode of season 1 of the show, which takes us back a fair while, where I traveled up to the Zambezi River, up to Zambia, with Cameron van der Berg and his then girlfriend, subsequently fiancée, now wife, Nefeli, now living in London. And Cam joined me, and we did a lot around the area. We traveled on a train onto the bridge. We went and raced against cheetahs and walked on elephants, or rode with elephants. But it was building up to this big challenge, which was a swimming race. between myself and Cameron, given that I had been part of the Selborne-Rutledge under-11 4x25 meter relay team that finished a credible third in the Harare Schools B relay in 1987 and 1988. And so we had this race, and it was terrifying for three reasons. We had about a 50-meter stretch. One of them is you're getting into the Zambezi River, which is home to rather a lot of crocodiles. Secondly, was that the race finished literally 3 meters from the falls. And it's strange, you'd imagine, because there's this 108-meter drop, that there'd be this massive roar of water washing over, but it just suddenly falls and there's nothing pulling you. So we sat, and it was only when I saw the video footage afterwards I realized just how daft this was and how scary it looked. And we were peering right over the edge. But what was the scariest moment of all, without doubt, was having to stand on camera next to Cameron van der Berg, the Olympic swimmer, and both of us had our shirts off, which was not easy to do.
And I'm sure you looked 50 times better than he did, without doubt.
I think he looked better than he'd ever looked, simply by way of comparison.
Yeah. Brilliant. And Dan, I mean, you mentioned a couple of sportsmen earlier who've really blown you away. Is there one person in the sporting world that's really been head and shoulders above for you for any specific reason? Or, I mean, I suppose it's a broad question, but has there someone really made that impact in your life through the Dan Nicholl Show?
Ooh, a tough question. We've had so many inspiring stories. And I mentioned earlier Ron Rutland, I mentioned Grant Lottering. Every time you talk to somebody, I've had Evander Holyfield on the show, I've had Sean Fitzpatrick on the show, Edwin Moses, people who've had extraordinary careers and extraordinary records. But I think I often measure it by what reaction does it have on the audience. And when I can hear the collective breath being taken away. And when we had Chris Burtish on for the second time, the first time we had him on the show with then a young and not unknown, but certainly not world famous Sia Kolisi and Donovan Goliath, and they were collectively loads and loads of fun. But when we had Chris back the second time, he'd done his trip across the Atlantic on his stand-up paddleboard, and he told stories like being hit in a storm with 5-story waves, where every 90 seconds he was being bashed and having to waking up to the sound of his radar alarm, because within a mile there were 3 container ships or oil tankers at 3 in the morning, none of them responding to his beacon. Waking up because he heard a sound and then felt something rubbing against his tiny little craft, and it was a shark sizing up whether this was something to attack. And he one night felt his craft being pulled under the water, and he had to scuba up and dive into the water with a knife in the middle of the night, because his parachute anchor, which at night was keeping him relatively stable, had been spotted as potential food by a giant squid, which was pulling the entire vessel under the surface, and he had to cut loose his parachute anchor. And he tells this story in such a matter-of-fact way, but still conveying the extraordinary magnitude of the challenges that he went through, how he kept sane, how he kept physically in one piece. It is, I think, is an incredible story, as I've heard, and one that I wish had got a little bit more coverage, because I don't think enough people know just how incredible it was for him to be able to complete that particular journey.
Sure, that is something quite remarkable. Dan, you're not only a famous TV celebrity and host, you're also a wine connoisseur. And every year during the Absa Epic, while you are in between your commentating sessions, you go on a little wine journey. Tell us a bit about that, and then what you do after the end of the Absa Epic.
So the Epic played a crucial role in the development of my wine business. I host an online wine show called Dan Really Likes Wine, the nature of which I don't think is too difficult to ascertain. And it stemmed out of initially a love of wine. I did a lot of food and wine writing in my days as a journalist to counterbalance the endless sports stories. and taught myself, learned from a lot of people, did cooking classes, went to a lot of wine tastings. And the Epic presented a great opportunity, given the nature of its route, to visit a lot of wine estates, wine farms, wine producers, a little off the beaten track, people you don't normally get to, and certainly I wouldn't normally get to go and meet them. Not do a massive amount of tasting because I'm working. It's more talking to, meeting the people, making use of the spittoon because that's what you have to do, and then purchasing wine. And it started with buying a few bottles here and there, but as the wine interest grew, so the wine collection grew, to the point where I'd finish the Epic with a bootload full of 50 or 60 cases of wine picked up from around the route, often from wine estates I'd never heard of before, let alone visited. That's how I first met Samantha O'Keefe from Lismore in Greyton. It's how I first got out to Luddite in the Beaumont area, Bott River Valley area. Loads of different guys I met for the very first time, people up in Tulbach, in Wellington. And in 2016, an event which I know you've partaken in before, the Epic Wine Tasting. I hosted what has become, for me, one of my favorite parts of the Epic, where I tell the story of the Epic through the medium of wine, whereby we'll start off with a Charles Fox Cup Classique, the wonderful Cup Classique producer from just outside of Elgin, and explain to the guests, who will be riders, sponsors, friends of the Epic, members of the media, and explain to them, right, this is the Cup Classique we would have gone through on day 2, quite early in the morning if you're at the front of the race, a little later on if you were further back, and give some tasting notes. Everybody tries it together and work through usually a dozen or so wines. And it's great fun and a lovely way to remember where we've been on the route, and to allow the cyclists to try some of the wine that they wouldn't have had a chance to, because they're all being very professional, with the exception of one or two. We won't mention Colin Charvis and Morris Herter in particular, who often stop for a glass of wine. But it was at the 2016 Epic Wine Tasting where Michael Jordan, the barefoot entrepreneur who swapped being a bank teller for investing in thousands of startups and doing so very successfully, came up to me, showed me a video of Gary Vaynerchuk, the American who started his media empire by making wine videos, and said, look, you need to do something similar for South Africa. I had a look at it and thought, ish, Michael Jordan, it's great, but he's probably just had an extra glass of Chardonnay and isn't being too serious. But Michael phoned me the next day, the day after that, and the day after that. And so in November 2016, we got Dan Really Likes Wine up and running as a weekly online show, not with terribly high expectations, to be honest, just a nice way to enjoy some wine. Didn't think it would last very long. And we are now sitting in 2020. The show is sponsored by Pick and Pay. We have, I think last week's show had over 20,000 people watch it on Facebook video. And it's just been a really fun way to approach a subject and a space that a lot of people feel a little bit intimidated by. The language of wine can be very exclusive. We tend to use terms in the wine industry that most people neither understand nor really care for. How many people are really interested in what the malolactic fermentation process of a wine was, or how much time it spent on lees, or the residual sugar? These are not unimportant things, but to the general wine drinker, discussing them kind of puts a barrier to appreciating them, to feeling like you can drink them. So I try not to be too technical, have a bit of a taste, tell a story about wine, discuss it, engage with the winemakers whenever I can. So now doing live wine tasting on Facebook Live every Tuesday and Thursday, and just having some fun conversations about an industry that I think sits alongside of sport as the one that does South Africa proudest around the world. Because wherever I travel, and I travel extensively, it's never too hard to find a bottle of South African wine. There won't be many, and I'll often be surprised as to what I find, but wine flies our South African flag very high right around the world, and it's an industry we should be enormously proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, sort of going back to a similar question where I asked you about that one sportsman, has there been that one wine that has stood out for you at any point through this journey of yours?
It is such a brutal question. It's one I have been asked before, and the answer probably changes every time. You ask a lot of people, and I tell you, the wine I'm drinking at the moment is the one I enjoy most. I think for me, it's wine is very much about context, about situation. Who am I sharing the wine with? What am I drinking it for, to celebrate? And I had at my wedding, we got married at the Backsburg wine estate, a lot of wine from Backsburg, and so I'll always be particularly fond of the wine there. But if I think of one in particular, the Only Else Proprietors Syrah, it's and Proprietors Blend, the two of them, they're both really, really good wines in themselves, but Only Else very kindly arranged for them to be sent from his distributor in Germany down to my Greek wife's family village in Greece for the christening of 2 children. We had the christenings in the family church, and then in the village taverna, we had everybody in. We had plenty of Greek wine, but on each occasion, 20 cases of Only Else wine arrived, thanks to the Big Easy, who I've known for many years. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And so we were able to, in this village in Greece, eating Greek food, surrounded by Greek family and some South African friends and family and friends from other parts of the world, have South African wine to glue the whole event together. And so the wine itself is excellent, but my memory of it is amplified by the scenario in which I drank it.
Oh, fair enough. And Dan, just before we close, putting you on the spot, obviously you work at the Absa Cape Epic every year. Any thoughts of ever getting on the bike and maybe
you're breaking up there, Adam? I think, as you well know, and you're a horrible man, I suspected this question would come up. When I celebrated my 10th year on the Epic, so this would have been my 14th year. I missed the first 2. This would have been my 14th in succession. When I did the 10th, Kevin Vermaak, with a wicked smile upon his face, announced to an audience cheering gleefully that I would be given a free lifetime entry with partner of my choice ad infinitum for the duration of the Absa Cape Epic, knowing full well that I would never ever take up the invitation. I probably, and I don't say this lightly, I probably know the Epic pretty much better than anybody who hasn't ridden it. I certainly don't know it like anybody who's done an edition of the race, but having been out there, out on the route, watched the guys, and not watching the Christoph Sausers and the Karl Platz and the Jaroslav Kulhavis come charging in, the Annikas, those really top riders. It's watching the guys who come in after 9-10 hours at the end of each day. And I remember in particular with the Epic, it's probably the low point of my collection of memories. I was out in the Elgin area. The route was finishing in that area, and the next day was the final trip home down over the mountain. And I think we might have been still finishing Boschendal that year. But it was a horrible day. I was out, I think, near Gabrielskloof. The wind was driving, the rain was coming in. It was just really deeply unpleasant. And towards the back of the field, in came a cyclist on his own, looking very, very distraught, and he came charging up to the medical tent and erupted in French. And the doctors, I'd been welcoming a few people. I have some schoolboy French, so they called me across, and he explained that his partner had had a fall and he wanted to know what they had to do. And the partner came in about a minute later, pushing his bike, but you could see glazed over, wasn't really seeing the world properly. And so the doctors had a look at him, spoke to the partner, had a look at him again, and explained to me. And I asked the guy a couple of questions in French. We kind of got the answers out. And the doctor turned to me and said, "You have to tell him he's out of the race." They had 10 kilometers to go to the finish, and then the final stretch the day after. And so I looked at him and I was trying to work out, how do I say this, A, so he understands it, and B, so it's as gentle as possible. And I just said to him in very basic French, "I'm sorry, but the doctors have said you have to stop." And he just looked at me and he didn't say anything, and a tear just came out. And it was the single most heartbreaking moment I've had on the Epic. And he accepted it, but he'd been training for 6 months, I'm sure, maybe longer. He'd flown out from France. He'd got through every day, but at the end of the penultimate stage, he'd had that fall. He'd probably been concussed. And away he goes. "Oh, my apologies."
No problem.
There we go. So yeah, that's
Yeah, certainly brutal.
Yeah, and look, there are loads of stories along those lines. But if you want one just to offset that for a little bit of a slightly better cheer, because I can't leave you on such a sad note, Dr. Michael Mole, probably the most beautiful man to have ever ridden the Absa Epic, stopped every hour to moisturize. And Michael is well known as a TV presenter, did so many years with Top Billing. He's a fantastic guy, a great guest we've had on the Dan Nicholl Show. But he came to the end, I think it was possibly his second epic, and he fell off his bike on the penultimate stage, and his shoulder was dislocated. So he limped in to camp and realized something was wrong. He's a medical doctor, realized something was astray. So he went into the Mediclinic tent, spoke to one of the doctors, explained the situation. The doctor said, look, you've dislocated your shoulder and you're out of the race. Michael shook his head and he said, all right, I understand that, but please don't be terribly offended if I ask for a second opinion. The doctor said, well, that's fine. You can ask for 20 opinions. Every single one's going to be the same. No doctor is going to say that you can ride. So Michael said, okay. I said, but I'm a qualified medical doctor. So Michael, can Michael ride the Epic tomorrow? Yes, Michael. Michael can ride the Epic. Great. Thank you, Dr. Michael. And so given his own thumbs up, he strapped his shoulder up in immense pain, I have no doubt, gritted his teeth, and he rode through the final stage and finished the Absa Epic.
Oh, fantastic. You got to love those stories of the Absa Epic, that sheer courage. Dan, in closing, before we say goodbye, do you have a message for South Africans in this period? We're going to get through it, obviously, but you have great humor, you have great knowledge. Anything, word of wisdom for those that may be struggling a bit at this point?
Yeah, and I'm sure there are many people who are going through a really tough time. The extent of my challenges is trying to endure another episode of Peppa Pig or finding something else for my kids to do. So in context, the Nicholl family is very lucky. But for people who are either on their own, who are lonely or isolated, try and stay in touch with people, try and speak to friends, try and make those video calls just to keep your sanity. Try and keep reasonably healthy. I'm no Olympic athlete, but even if you're in an apartment, getting in some sit-ups, some push-ups, have a bit of fun, find fun ways to do a bit of exercise, do your very best to try and stay home, stay isolated. I know for huge tracts of South Africa that's not possible, but in as much as we can, this does have the potential to do a lot of damage to South Africa. I'm really hopeful that it won't, and I think the leadership of President Ramaphosa has been strong and assertive and admirable, and by and large, South Africa seemed to be doing the right thing, but it's not over. It's probably not going to be over for a while yet. Try and keep that sense of humor. Try and find a reason to be smile, a reason to be grateful, a reason to look forward to life when it comes back to a semblance of normalcy. And remember that we're a really, really resilient country. We've come through a lot in our shared past. We've had a lot of dark times. We will get through this. We will bear some scars from it, but we're stronger when it's all done. And I know that South Africa will be a stronger and better place one day in the future.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, and good luck with your trampoline practicing. And we hope to see you in 2021 in the green and gold.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much. Thanks for keeping me sane and giving me a few smiles, and keep up the great work.
Cheers, Dan. Take care. Join us tomorrow for episode 12 of Sport SA Daily Diary, where we'll be chatting to Springbok rower Bridget Hartley.